Hello, welcome back to our lecture series for Western Civilization 101. We, of course, just recently learned about the Byzantine Empire, Byzantine civilization. That's basically the eastern half of what was left of the Roman Empire. And today, of course, we'll turn our focus onto the rise of Islam, or Islamic civilization, which began in the 7th century. And the beginnings of Islam is centered on in Arabia, or today, of course, you know it as Saudi Arabia. And you'll learn from this lecture, of course, with the rise of Islam, how the traditions and the teachings come about, how Islam will not remain centered here on in Saudi Arabia, as we know it today, but will expand and spread even up into the southern part of Spain, where they will also have a foothold as well. Now, you'll of course learn about a man by the name of Muhammad, learn about his career, the founder of Islam, and you know how he came to form this thought or this religion. We'll find out, of course, about the very important centers for the Islamic faith in Mecca, also in Saudi Arabia, and another important center would be in the city of Medina. The Kaaba, which is a very important a place for a pilgrimage shrine, is located in the city of Mecca. You know, a little bit about Muhammad, of course. He was born in Mecca, actually, around the late 6th century. And his parents died when he was little, and he was an orphan. He actually entered the service of a rich widow and actually married her later on. But he had a religious experience that will change him when he was, I don't know, maybe about 40 years old. And the angel Gabriel, you'll also find out too, the similarities will be discussed between Christianity and Islam. There are differences, obviously, but there are a lot of similarities that people sometimes don't realize with the two faiths. The angel Gabriel began giving him revelations and basically told him that the Arabs had to submit to God's will, of course, God being known as Allah. Because before the Islamic faith takes hold, most Arabs, of course, were polytheistic, as is most people that we've discussed with this series on Western Civilization 101. The Islamic civilization, we will see that they also have a very important book, just like the Christian faith. Of course, the Christian faith would be the Bible. The very important book with the Islamic faith is known as the Quran. There were a lot of different codes that people needed to live by with the Islamic faith. I'm not going to name them all, but one would be that you'd have to make a pilgrimage to Mecca and visit that shrine, the Kaaba, at least once during your lifetime. And another, you were forbidden to eat pork or gamble. You would fast during daylight hours for 1 month each year. It's called Ramadan. You know, the similarities between Christianity and the Islamic faith, both are monotheistic, one God. Both will stress morals, use of a Bible for the Word of God, Judgment Day, resurrection, belief in angels. Now, Muhammad said that he could not perform miracles. The only, of course, miracle, I guess, is when he wrote the Quran. And he acknowledged Jesus Christ, but not as a God, obviously, but Muhammad acknowledged Christ as a great prophet. Of course, we're going to have a problem, as with any religion, and you've learned about the rise in Christianity, and of course you've learned about Judaism and its importance in Western civilization. But as we see with these religions that start growing in numbers, we'll start having more organization occurring as part of the religion. And when Muhammad dies, the Islamic faith, the hierarchy, the social structure will suffer, because he didn't name a successor kind of as the person that will take over after him. And so we're going to have a split between different factions, I guess you can say, in the Islamic community as to who should kind of lead them in a way. Of course, we will see that the Arabs will gain control of the Persian Empire by around 651, Egypt by around 646 A.D., North Africa and Spain by the year, I guess, around 711. And we will see that, as the Islamic civilization spreads even onto the European continent, it gains more and more followers, of course, and it is still a very important religion today. And it's still divided. You actually have the Shiites and the Sunnis that are still in existence even today because of this earlier division within the Islamic community. So let's find out more about the rise of Islam.
The Arabs, who inherited much of the Arabian Peninsula to the Euphrates River, played a really small role in antiquity. When you look at the chroniclers of the ancient world, you see very little mention of the Arab community. They were nondescript and inconsequential in the larger scope of events in the period. In the early 7th century, the Arab world was disorganized, was extraordinarily turbulent. The area had long been dominated by first the Romans and then the Persians. There's a really odd organization to the region. There is a unique and diverse political culture to the region and a diverse religious culture in the region. You need to keep in mind that for a period, portions of Arabia were under Roman rule, and the Romans are going to bring Christianity. And when the Persians rule in the area, they're going to bring Zoroastrianism. And the Zoroastrian faith isn't going to exist independent. It's going to exist alongside with Christianity, with the Jewish faith, and even with the Buddhist faith. So this is a region where there's a lot of diversity, a lot of religious diversity. Most Arabs, however, were polytheistic. They worshipped a multitude of gods, and the Christians, the Jews, the Buddhists, they were all clearly minorities in the Arab world. The Arab world was a delicate one. It was one in which violence was very, very common. The most common people in the Arab world were the Bedouins. The Bedouins were largely nomadic pastoralists. They had their sheep, they had herds of goats, they roamed around the countryside in caravans, moving and selling goods, setting up little towns, and moving and transporting goods from point A to point B, trying to sell items that they had at their disposal. What you have here, though, in these caravan routes were often hotly contested, and different Bedouin groups were regularly attacking each other. There were raids that were constant along the caravan routes across the Arabian Peninsula. Violence was a very common occurrence in this world. There were some farmers in the Arabian Peninsula, but the soil and the climate was just not conducive to any real substantial agriculture. So the agricultural commodities are going to have to be brought in to the Arabian world. Cities that did exist in Arabia often were the headquarters of some of the major traders along the Arabian Peninsula. They too were involved in the caravan routes, but their items for sale were largely different. They were the dealers in luxury items, things like spices and incense and perfumes. These were the kind of things that the more wealthy traders from the towns, this is the kind of stuff that they tended to sell. Mecca is perhaps the largest trading community in the Arabian Peninsula. It was the biggest city, certainly in Arabia, but it too constantly faced competition, challenges to its authority from rival towns that were trying to rise in prominence. And traders in and out of Mecca also regularly faced raids from surrounding Bedouins, from surrounding towns. It was an insular world, and it was a violent world. The solution to the problem, at least in the Arabian world as it existed, was something called the haram. The haram were sanctuaries all along the trading routes throughout the Arabian Peninsula. These were places where parties that had disputes with each other, where different caravan groups would be at odds and fighting, they would go to a haram, and here they would sit down and try to peacefully work out their disagreements with each other without resorting to the all-too-common murder. Mecca was the chief haram in the Arabian Peninsula. And this is no big surprise. With Mecca being the largest city, it's natural that the haram there would be the major one in the Arabian world. The focus of the haram in Arabia, in Mecca I should say, was the black stone shrine. This black stone shrine is often called the Kaaba. It today has enormous significance in the Islamic world. It had and had long had major significance in the city of Mecca. Long before the creation of Islam, the Kaaba was in place. It allegedly was a place where pilgrims from throughout the Arabian world would come. It wasn't just part of the haram where peaceful negotiations took place. It was a religious shrine. And remember, the people of Arabia were a polytheistic people. So they would come to the Kaaba, where it was alleged that the moon god, for example, had his major location. And there were lots of lesser deities who also called the Kaaba home. It was a place where the polytheistic Arabian world would come to offer incense and offer pilgrimages to these locations. It was the center of the city of Mecca. We know later on, of course, when the Islamic faith is going to emerge and going to spread, that the Kaaba and the Black Stone Shrine is going to take on even greater significance. It's going to be alleged that the Black Stone itself was actually given to Abraham and Ishmael by God, and they were the ones who brought it to Mecca and placed it in that location, thus creating the origins and the tie of this Kaaba to the Islamic faith later on. It was in this violent and conflict-ridden world where, caravans were regularly attacked, where city would battle city, where Bedouin tribe would battle Bedouin tribe. This is the world in which Muhammad was born into. In 570, we have the official birth of Muhammad, and he is going to be a figure who is going to transform the Arabian Peninsula all the way up until his death in 632. Now, we know a little about the origins of Muhammad. When he was born in 570, his father had died before he was even born. His mother is going to die shortly after giving birth to Muhammad. And Muhammad is going to be raised by his grandparents. Muhammad is, as a citizen of Mecca, is going to be involved in the practice of trade. He's going to be involved in the caravan trade route. It was just natural for a child in Mecca to get involved in the principal business of the Meccan world, which was getting involved in the caravan trade route. At the age of 20, he was already known as a very skilled businessman in many ways. He was extraordinarily competent. People trusted him. If Muhammad was involved in a transaction, you could rest assured that it was going to be fair, it was going to be equitable, and Muhammad knew what he was doing. Right? He was also known for being a very upright guy, a guy who was extraordinarily moral. Even as a youth, there's a lot of signs that we get, at least from the history of Muhammad, that he had some pretty special spiritual insights that were not typical of young people in his day and age. We have stories of Muhammad regularly going out into the desert surrounding the city of Mecca. And there he would go into caves and he would fast. And he would do things like contemplate the nature of the universe and all that kind of stuff. Unusual. In the year 610, and now he's significantly older, right? He's 40 years old at this point in time, he is going to have the first of his many revelations for the remainder of his life. This is the revelation, this first one in 610 is the most important one. It is the one that told him to teach all the people about the glories of Allah, right? The sole God, the one God. And he was encouraged in many ways to create a new faith based on belief in Allah as the sole God. Furthermore, as part of his revelations, it was clear that Allah wanted Muhammad to do more than just create a faith that was monotheistic, but he also was expected to create a world in the Arab community in which Arabs took care of fellow Arabs. There was an idea of justice and commitment to each other for those who would become a part of this new faith. So he gets this revelation in 610 that Allah is the sole God and that he, Muhammad, was responsible for spreading the faith and creating a community of believers that not only believed in Allah, but had a commitment to each other and a sense of social justice to fellow believers. Hence the beginning of the Islamic faith with his revelation in 610. Well, Muhammad is going to do a good job converting his family in Mecca, but he's not going to do a very good job extending his monotheistic faith to the remainder of the Meccan world. There's going to be a lot of folks who are part of the Meccan hierarchy who were very distrustful of Muhammad, who didn't like his criticism of the polytheistic faith. There's going to be efforts to crack down on Muhammad's belief system. And there's also going to be a plot afoot by the Meccan economic leaders primarily to try to assassinate Muhammad. Muhammad, however, is going to have an out and have an opportunity to get out of Mecca. The town of Medina, which is not that far away from Mecca, is going to be looking for somebody to lead the haram there. They were looking for somebody who was trustworthy, someone who people could look to and have their disputes settled. And Medina was a city that was rising, and it was a city that was in competition in many ways with Mecca. Muhammad is offered and extended an invitation, come to Medina, and you will have the opportunity here to lead our haram and potentially to expand your faith. And this ultimately is what Muhammad is going to do, facing very real prospects of his imminent death in Mecca on September 24th, 622. September 24th, 622, Muhammad and a group of his followers are going to leave Mecca and head to Medina. In the Islamic world, this is known as the flight. This marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar. In many ways, as the Christian calendar is marked by the birth of Christ, the Islamic calendar is marked by the flight of Muhammad from Mecca to Medina. We have this taking place in 622, in September of 622. Very quickly, when Muhammad reaches Medina, his faith is going to spread very quickly. And you're going to have the conversion of the large percentage of the folks in Medina to this Islamic faith. And remember, Muhammad has an axe to grind with the leadership in Mecca. He's very angry with how he was treated. He was very angry that he was forced out of his ancestral home. And it's not too long before Medina raiding parties are going to be regularly interacting and fighting with parties from Mecca. It's not too long between this period of the flight before we're going to have Mecca ultimately being conquered by Muhammad and his followers in Medina. During the 620s, you're going to have this conflict between Medina and Mecca, the rival cities. But by 630, Mecca is clearly under the thumb now of Medina, and it's under the control of Muhammad. In 630, Muhammad and his followers are going to return to his ancestral home. They're going to return as conquerors to Mecca. Now, the two principal cities, thus, on the Arabian Peninsula, Mecca and Medina, are now going to be converts to the Islamic faith, to this monotheistic faith. The polytheistic practices are still going to exist, but those are slowly going to be crushed and pushed out and being replaced by the Islamic faith. When you have the two big cities conquered, the next step was to spread the faith to the Bedouins. And the Bedouins, remember, were those nomadic pastoralists who roamed about the desert, involved primarily in trade. It was these people that Muhammad is going to focus the rest of his attention on before his death. Remember, when he goes to Mecca in 630, he's very near death. He's going to pass in 632, and now there's going to be a change, at least in the Arab world. But before we talk about the successors to Muhammad and who is going to ultimately expand the Islamic kingdom beyond Mecca, Medina, and the surrounding countryside, we need to spend a little bit of time taking a look at this Islamic faith that was being created here on the Arabian Peninsula by Muhammad. What can we say about the faith? The most basic precept is the one that we talked about before, that was revealed in the very first revelation that Muhammad received. Right? The revelation is that there is one God, and that God is Allah. And the basic principle, the basic precept of the Islamic faith is the al-Islam. The al-Islam is nothing more than the surrender. It's the surrender of the individual to Allah. Right? In essence, you're giving up yourself towards the one true God. So the al-Islam is the surrender. The surrender creates the Muslim and makes you a Muslim. A Muslim, of course, is an individual who has participated in the surrender and who, more importantly, right, one God, Allah, acceptance of Muhammad as Allah's principal prophet, and also the notion of being a part of the fellowship of fellow Muslims, the fellowship of believers. Right? We all believe in Allah. We are part of a community. We have an obligation to look out for each other and to take care of each other who are part of the faith. Right? That's a critical component. There is definitely a communal component to the Islamic world. As part of the central tenets of the Islamic faith, there are what we know as the 5 pillars of Islam. These are the 5 most important precepts of the Islamic faith. The first of these is what we've already mentioned, this profession of faith. There is no other God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. That's the very first pillar of Islam, the very central core to the faith itself. The second pillar of Islam is that devoted Muslims are to pray 5 times a day. So there's an injunction to pray 5 times a day as your second pillar of Islam. Your third pillar of Islam is a requirement for all Muslims to fast from sunup to sunset at least 1 month out of the year, which today is associated with the feast of the Ramadan. But in the early days of your 5 pillars of Islam, the origins of the faith, right, all Muslims are required to fast 1 month a year from sunrise to sunset. All Muslims are required to give alms, up to 10% of their fortune each year, to the Muslim community, to the faith, right? Because remember, the commitment isn't just to Allah, but as part of your commitment with Allah, it's also this commitment to all fellow Muslims. So hence, giving 10%, giving alms, is something that's essential to the Islamic faith as well. And finally, the last pillar of Islam is that all Muslims, during the course of their lives, are expected to make a pilgrimage to the holiest of holy cities. That is, of course, the city of Mecca. At least once in your life, all Muslims are to make a pilgrimage there. Now, Muhammad always claimed that he received God's word directly, and his scriptures and his speaking and his writings on the faith, right, are the direct revelation of God. These are not interpretations of things that he had received and is just writing about in passing later on. These are direct verbal revelation. So it's the word of God in the Muslim holy book, right? There is no interpretation. It's direct revelation. The revelation come in the forms of various recitations that make up the Quran, which of course is the Islamic holy book. The Quran contains legal and wisdom literature. The Quran contains lots of moral teachings. The Quran was something that was loosely organized and loosely understood until the death of Muhammad. When Muhammad died, it becomes important to create an organized book that we know as the Quran today. Before, it's this kind of loose corpus of information. But once Muhammad dies, right, his followers put together the Quran. And the Quran is divided up into multiple sections, right? There are very long sections and very short sections. The long sections come first in the Quran. The short sections come later on. It is a uniform statement of faith that is in the Quran. Allah's will, the will of Allah, touches everyone and all aspects of the faithful. You have Islam being not only a faith in which you have to believe, but there's also a series of practices, there's a series of allegiances that all Muslims must adhere to and must follow. There are dietary regulations. There are rules and codes governing personal conduct. Things like alcohol and gambling are prohibited. Right? Luxury and ostentation are downgraded and denigrated in the Quran. There is extreme sexual morality as being advocated, modesty being preached for both men and women, but especially for women. Whereas the Quran claims that women are to be kept out of public view. And if they are to go into public, they're supposed to be completely covered, save for their eyes, right? So there's very strict laws in the Quran governing personal habits, personal behavior. We have, for example, in the Arabian world before the spread of the Muslim faith, you have the practice of polygamy was very, very common. And the wealthier an individual was, the more common it was for this individual to have a very large number of wives. The Quran limits the number of wives a man could have, limits them to just 4, right, rather than 10, 15 or more. Now, today this might seem a little bit excessive, but nonetheless, right, 4 was put into place. So it's a great curtailment of the norm, giving you a sense of the importance of following the code. No longer could a man just say, I want 5, 6, 7 wives. Right now, you're limited to just 4. The reward for abstinence in your current life, the reward for not consuming alcohol, for not gambling, for following the sexual codes and the dietary codes of the Islamic faith, right? The reward was an afterlife, an eternity of sensual pleasure. So in many ways, the here and now for the followers of the early Islamic faith was the roughest part, was the one in which they had to surrender themselves completely to Allah. But the afterlife, right, is the world of sensual pleasures, where the strict codes were loosened. Muhammad's death, of course, is going to bring about a significant issue regarding who is the rightful successor of the prophet. I mean, because you are talking about the death of an individual who spoke directly with Allah. So filling his shoes is an incredibly important task. In 632, the Meccan elite are going to gravitate to one of their own. And they are going to raise Abu Bakr to the new position of caliph. And a caliph is a successor to the prophet, as it's understood. Abu Bakr was the successor to Muhammad. He is a member of the Meccan elite and is loosely tied to Muhammad through marriage, as we're going to see a lot of these early caliphs or successor to Muhammad are going to be. They're going to be members of the Meccan elite. They're going to be relatives of the prophet Muhammad via marriage, and they're all going to be kind of relatively early converts to the faith, Abu Bakr being the first. It's going to be Abu Bakr who is going to continue the fight that Muhammad began before he died. It was the fight to spread the Islamic faith, to spread the Muslim world to the Bedouins. It's going to be Abu Bakr who is going to succeed in this undertaking and is going to pass to his successor, Umar, a united Arabian Peninsula. So you have Muhammad taking Mecca and Medina, working on spreading the Islamic faith to the Bedouins. You're going to have Abu Bakr succeeding him as caliph. Remember, caliph is successor to the prophet. Abu Bakr is going to spread the Islamic faith to the remainder of the Arabian Peninsula, converting those Bedouins. And when he is succeeded by Umar, Umar is going to begin the lightning conquest of the Persian and the Roman empires, right? He is going to greatly expand the borders of the Islamic kingdom which is now clearly emerging. It's no longer just Arabia, but it expands out into the Persian world, into the Roman world as well. Umar is going to be murdered by a slave in 644, leaving his successor, Uthman, as the new leader of the Islamic kingdom. Uthman is going to be a little bit different, and Uthman is going to now have a very large empire under his command. Right? You need to bear in mind just how quickly the Islamic kingdom is going to spread in a very short period of time. So administration of this new giant kingdom that was emerging is going to fall to Uthman, and it's going to be a very, very difficult challenge for him. Uthman figures one of the best ways in order to stabilize my Islamic kingdom is to centralize finances throughout the kingdom. This is going to be problematic because he is going to try to centralize the economy, and this is going to antagonize, right, the people in Egypt, the people in Syria, the people in Iraq, who had been conquered and are now very uncomfortable with the fact that Uthman is trying to centralize all the finances throughout the provinces. Uthman himself is going to be murdered in 656, and he is going to be replaced by Ali. Ali is going to take his place as the caliph. Ali is going to be the last in that first line of caliphs who are going to be directly related to the Prophet Muhammad. Remember, they're related via marriage, but nonetheless, right, they are clear in the kinship network tied to the Prophet Muhammad, and hence from Muhammad to Allah himself. Ali is going to be the last of these. Ali is going to be someone who is going to change the role of caliph. And Ali is going to be extraordinarily important for the future of the Islamic world. Ali is going to view his role as caliph as having less to do with being a bureaucrat and being a leader in a traditional sense of a politician. You're going to have Ali conceptualizing the role of caliph and making the role of caliph in his time a religious office, an office that emphasized the religious side of the caliph's position. And this is going to be something that Ali is going to bring to the forefront. And it's not surprising, of course, when you consider how Uthman, the man who came before him, was something of a bureaucrat, something of a politician, and it was Uthman who ran into lots of problems. Ali is going to emphasize the caliph and that office as a religious place, as the role of the caliph is to spread the faith and uphold the faith rather than conquer territory and make money. Ali is going to be killed himself in 661 by a disillusioned follower, and we're going to have a series of further disputes over who should be the successor to Ali. Years later, Ali is going to be resurrected as a popular figure in the Islamic world because Ali is going to be looked to as the model of what a caliph should truly be, right? He was the Prophet's son-in-law, so he's directly related to Muhammad. He was committed to the equality of all believers in the idea of rigidly following the faith, a stern conception of Islam. The Muslims who believe that Ali is the right way to be a caliph and the way he was caliph was the correct way are going to be known as the Shia Muslims. They are the party of Ali, right? The Shia Muslims. And we know that today, right? We know that there's a great schism within the Islamic world over, right, the Shia Muslims and the Sunni Muslims, and we'll talk about those in due time. So the party of Ali are the Shia Muslims. They're the ones who believe that the caliph, that the leader of the Islamic world, right, shouldn't be a politician and a bureaucrat. He should be a holy man, a religious man, a man devoted to the Islamic faith, devoted to the principles that Muhammad was given by Allah. That is the cornerstone of what a good caliph should be. While Ali was alive and while Ali was caliph, his reign was not without controversy. And that's important to keep in mind when we think of the schism that's going to emerge within the Islamic faith after the death of Ali. A civil war is going to break out in the middle of the 7th century between Ali, the caliph, and Muawiyah. Muawiyah is going to be the governor of Syria, and he's going to resent Ali's rule. Muawiyah is going to be from an elite Meccan family himself. He is going to be a member of the Umayyad family. it's going to be the Umayyad family under the leadership of Muawiyah, who's going to engage in kind of a civil war against Ali and his caliphate. So there's going to be intense controversy. When Ali dies, right, this is when Muawiyah is going to rise to power and become the new caliph of the Islamic world. The key to remember about Muawiyah is he has no direct connection to the Prophet Muhammad. Unlike all of the earlier caliphates, when Muawiyah takes charge and becomes the new caliphate, the new caliph of the Islamic world, he is going to be the first of the Umayyad dynasty. He is going to be the first that does not have a direct connection, right, to the Prophet Muhammad. Now, when Muawiyah dies in 680, there's going to be another controversy once again. Right? You're going to have Muawiyah's successor, right? Muawiyah's son is going to be battling with one of Ali's relatives over who should be the new caliph of the Islamic kingdom. So, following the death of Ali, you have Muawiyah, but then Muawiyah dies, and then you're going to have another controversy in the Islamic world. Who is going to be the new caliph? At the end of the day, we see that Ali's family is going to fail, and the Muawiyah strain, the Umayyad dynasty, is going to continue. The Umayyad dynasty are going to be politicians, more so than religious figures. It's going to be this group that the Umayyad dynasty is going to be the group that the Sunni Muslims, even to this day, owe their origins to. They are the ones who believe in the sanctity of the Umayyad dynasty, whereas the Shia Muslims, or sometimes you'll see them referred to as the Shiite Muslims, the Shia Muslims believe in the line of Ali. They are the party of Ali rather than the Umayyad dynasty. So there's your kind of controversy. One group, it believes in a very religious caliph, that's the Shia. The Sunni have a more secular approach to politics and running things. They follow the Umayyad line, and the Umayyad line is going to continue on for quite a number of time. But again, the Umayyad dynasty that emerges and rules the Islamic kingdom is going to be a dynasty that is not without controversy, that is not without problems. They're going to be a bureaucratic state. They're going to be a state that focuses on finances and taxation, a state in which a lot of folks believe that religion was being given short shrift, that religion wasn't being given the proper respect that a Muslim state should accord it. So there was already controversies within the Umayyad dynasty about the legitimacy of them, because remember, they're not descendants of Muhammad, but also because their practices tended to de-emphasize the importance of religion, the importance of the 5 pillars. And this was very problematic to the more pious of the Muslims, who believed that things had gone awry once Ali passed and the new caliph was someone who was not a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. Ultimately, you're going to have a situation where more pious Muslims are going to create a rival caliph to the Umayyad dynasty. And when you have a schism like this, in which there are rival caliphs, there is Abu al-Abbas as one caliph against the Umayyad caliph. So Abu al-Abbas is going to be a guy who's going to be risen to the caliphate in 749. And he's going to be a caliph, and there's going to be a rival Umayyad caliph. So you have a division in the Arab world. Abbas is ultimately going to defeat the Umayyad caliph in 750, creating a new kingdom, a new Abbasid dynasty, which is going to rule for a while on after the Umayyad dynasty had collapsed. So in 750, we have the emergence of a new dynasty in the Islamic world. It begins with Abu al-Abbas, and it's going to continue for a number of years, the Abbasid dynasty. Now, all of this change that we see taking place is all part of the regular growth and development of this religious kingdom. Think in many ways of how when we looked at and when you heard lectures on the rise of Christianity or the rise of the Jewish state, remember how there was a lot of division amongst the faithful early on, and you have a lot of schisms and controversies until you see the emergence of the faith in its more modern form. In many ways, that's what's going on here in the early days following the death of Muhammad. Because when Muhammad died, remember, he is the one who received God's revelation directly. when he dies, there's a bit of controversy and a bit of chaos surrounding, well, what do we do now? Which is why you have the codification of the Quran following the death of Muhammad. When Muhammad's alive, you don't need a codified holy book. But when Muhammad dies, you need a clear and uniform holy book, which gives us the emergence of the Quran with all of its wisdom, literature, and whatnot. That emerges after the death of Muhammad. You have the family members, the direct descendants in some way of Muhammad for the first few decades of Islamic rule. You have the conquest of the Arabian Peninsula, the defeat of the Bedouins, or at least the conversion of the Bedouins to the Islamic faith. You have then the spreading of the Islamic faith into the Persian and Roman empires. You have then, of course, controversy emerging when you have the death of Ali. Right? Remember, Ali was the last of those direct descendants of Muhammad. Ali was the caliph who creates a more pious and more religiously rigid state. His death brings us a new rule, right? And the Umayyad dynasty takes place after Ali passes. The Umayyads are more secular, they're more bureaucratic. The Islamic faith is still, of course, the center of the empire, but there's also concerns with politics, with money, and with waging war and defending territories. You have, of course, the rival caliphate in the mid-700s. The rival caliphate ends in the end of the Umayyad dynasty, the rise of the Abbasid period. Right? There's a lot of change which takes place in the Islamic world. But what's important to keep in mind here is no matter who's in charge, right, whether it's a direct descendant of Muhammad or someone else, that it's important to remember just how rapidly the Islamic world spread. When you think of the spread and the expansion of the Roman Empire, you think of something that took place over the course of 350 years. It's a slow, gradual expansion and conquest of territory. In the Islamic community, when the Islamic faith spread, it reaches its peak of expansion, its zenith of territorial conquest in about 100 years. That is shockingly, shockingly fast. How is it that what began as a turbulent region with lots of conflict and lots of division between tribal groups, between cities, how is it that this disorganized Arabian Peninsula is in many ways going to conquer so much territory so very fast? Well, one of the reasons is simply because the neighbors, the Persian Empire, the Roman Empire, are going to be in the periods of grave decline. Right? These are places, these are nations, these are kingdoms that had weakened themselves financially, that had weakened themselves militarily through a series of wars so that they were in a very, very weakened state at the time of the Caliphate of Umar. By the time Umar takes power and becomes the new caliph of the Islamic kingdom, right? The rival kingdoms of Persia, the rival kingdoms of the Roman Empire, of the Byzantine Empire, were already greatly weakened. So when Umar begins his conquest of the Persian and the Byzantine Empire, he is not attacking empires that are at the peak of strength. Here, he is taking on empires that were ruined by war, both financially and militarily, making the process of conquest that much easier. It's also important to keep in mind that the empires that were being conquered by the Muslims were empires that were very, very diverse, making it much easier to conquer. These were not the early days of the Persian Empire or the peak of the Roman Empire when there was a uniform populace. These were empires that were barely held together, right? When you start to expand and conquer territories and you start bringing people in from different backgrounds and different religious traditions and different political traditions, and you conquer them, their loyalty to the greater kingdom is never going to be as great as the loyalty of the core subjects of that kingdom. So when Umar begins his conquest, when the caliphates begin the conquest of their neighbors, it's very easy to do. You have weakened territories, militarily, financially weak territories. You have diverse populations that could care less that they are no longer under Persian rule, for example. Heck, this is no worse than what we experienced before. It's also important to keep in mind that it's the nature of the Muslim kingdom to expand and to conquer its neighbors for generations. Remember, within the Arab world, before Islam emerges, you have this constant state of warfare, which is why I made such a big issue of it at the beginning of this lecture. Why all along the caravan routes in the Arabian Peninsula, there are raids and violence between rival tribes, rival cities. There's a lot of tension, a lot of antagonism. But once all those regions become converted to Islam, right, all of that fighting stops. And it has to, because fellow Muslims, right, those who surrender, those who are a part of the al-Islam, those individuals do not kill other Muslims. Muslims do not fight other Muslims. Is the basic principle of the Muslim world. So if the old style of doing things, i.e. you're constantly at war with your neighbors, if that is no longer possible because the Arabian Peninsula is now overwhelmingly Islamic, well, what do you do now? As the story goes, it was just natural, well, you expand. And a new violent outlet was needed in the Arab world, in a world where violence was a part of life. Right? It was just rivalries, it was tensions over economic returns, over very small economic returns in a lot of cases. So you have Muslim ideology very quickly changing or altering from the early days of Muhammad. The Islamic world under the caliphates during the period of aggressive expansion divides the world into the House of Islam and the House of War. In the House of Islam, of course, it's the brotherhood of fellow Muslims. We all believe in the same things. We're all bound to look after and take care of each other. But outside of the House of Islam, that's the House of War. In the House of War, jihad, or holy war, is made, and holy war is the rule. It was a fairly simple concept. The infidels, and the infidel is someone who is not a Muslim, right? The infidel were expected to convert or likely be put to death, right? And that is the nature of life in the House of War. The House of Islam, it's peace, it's friendship, it's the brotherhood of Allah, the brotherhood of Islam. Outside of the House of Muhammad, the House of Allah, is the House of War, where jihad or holy war reigns. The infidels must convert, or the infidel must die. Now, there are some caveats to the infidel, and of course, times have changed, and those of you who are familiar with the Islamic world today know that things were not the same today as they were during the period of the Caliphate, the period of this great Islamic kingdom. Of the infidels, of those who did not follow the 5 pillars of Islam and declare Allah as the sole God and Muhammad as his prophet, there were 2 groups who were exempted from holy war, at least for now. In this period, those were Christians and Jews. And the reason Jews and Christians were spared from death was because they were also people of the book. Right? They were people of the book, and thus they came from the very same scriptural tradition where the Muslims came from, right? And they shared a common scriptural tradition. How, you might ask? Well, it's very simple. It all dates back to Abraham. And Abraham is, of course, a figure in the Old Testament, which is, of course, important to the Christian faith as well. Abraham's an important figure in the Jewish faith. He's thus an important figure in Christianity. But Abraham is also considered the founder of Mecca, which is the holiest of holy religious cities in the Islamic world. So there's this sense of kinship in many ways. And as the understanding in the Muslim world went, that Allah revealed himself to Moses, Allah revealed himself to the historical Jesus. So these worlds, the Jewish faith, the Christian faith, and the Muslim faith, in many ways share a lot of ties. It's the tie to Abraham for sure, but it's also the passage of revelations, or at least of wording to Moses and to Jesus as well. So the infidels do not necessarily extend to the Jewish and the Christian world. They are infidels in so much as they do not believe in the sole God of Allah, but they are not going to be put to death, at least not yet, because they have that same shared heritage, that same shared tradition. Now, starting in the early 800s, things begin to fall apart for the caliphate, for the Islamic kingdoms. And this is at the end of the Abbasid period when things are starting to come undone. There's a lot of reasons for this. There's intense family rivalries over who should be the next caliphate, who is the heir to the caliph. There were some who claimed that they are still the legitimate heirs of Muhammad. There are others who are making claims that they had closer kinship to this caliph or that caliph, all trying to jockey for position. So there's increasing controversy over who is the legitimate caliph, who is the new legitimate ruler of the Islamic kingdom. And over a period of time, there's going to be controversies over territory, controversies over taxation, and you're going to begin to see the slow and steady collapse of the Islamic Empire. In future lectures, you're going to hear about things like why Spain, for example, fell away from the Islamic world, and then North Africa, and on and on and on. You're going to see territories and provinces that once had been part of this great Islamic kingdom are going to begin to fall away. By the mid-10th century, the Islamic kingdom was a shell of its former self. The Islamic kingdom includes portions of Iraq, portions of Syria, Egypt, and Arabia, and that's pretty much it. So you're talking about a kingdom that had expanded dramatically, but by the 10th century had collapsed upon itself, right? Sections of Iraq, Syria, Egypt, Arabia, and that's really the sum total of the extent of the Arab world. But at one period at least, the Arab kingdom stretched all the way from the Atlantic Ocean to the outskirts of China. You are talking about a gigantic swath of territory that was ruled and conquered by the caliphs back in the center of the Arabian Peninsula. So you have an interesting situation here where this faith spreads very, very quick. But the Arab kingdom, the kingdom of Islam, was a victim in many ways of its own success, and it's a remarkable success. They conquered and exploited a non-Arab world. But over the course of time, they're going to begin to convert that Arab world, and a non-Arab world. And as they convert the non-Arab world, we're going to start to have a situation where there are going to be lots and lots of Muslims throughout the kingdom. And when you have that, it's not easy to exploit them. It's not easy to deny them opportunities because they are now followers of Muhammad, followers of the God Allah. They are now Muslims. And it's not possible anymore for those caliphs from Syria, as the Umayyads are going to be, or those caliphs who were from Mecca, right? It's not going to be possible any longer for the caliphs in the Arab world to kind of discriminate against the people that they conquered, which was typical of most empires. When empires expand, and we see this throughout history, empires expand, they conquer territories. Often the conquered provinces are going to be treated poorly until you make those conquered provinces and those conquered territories full-fledged members of the kingdom. And once you do that and make them full citizens, well, if they're full citizens, then you can't deny them basic rights anymore. You can't use them or exploit them for resources or for manpower. And this is the issue that plagued the Islamic kingdom as it began to expand. As it expanded, it conquered. As it conquered, it converted. As it converted, you create fellow members of the Muslim world, fellow brothers in the Islamic faith. And once you do that, you can no longer take advantage of those provinces. So whenever the caliph tries to establish some type of central authority, it's very difficult to do, which is one of the principal reasons why a lot of the provinces are going to slowly break away over the course of time. Is once you convert them, you've got to treat them as equals. So what we've dealt with today is the emergence of a brand new faith. It's a faith that's rooted in a monotheism, in a world that was violent, in a world that was largely overlooked in antiquity. It's not a world, the Arabian world is not something that we see a lot of the ancients writing about or talking about. The 7th century world, this world in which Muhammad is born, is a world of chaos, a world of conflict. It's a world of trade. It's a world of raids, trade and raids, to make a little rhyme. You have a situation where Muhammad is going to emerge. He's going to be recognized as a competent businessman and then a spiritual leader. And as a spiritual leader with a very powerful monotheistic message, Muhammad is going to convert the people of Medina, eventually take over and conquer the people of Mecca and convince them to embrace the Islamic faith. You're going to have that faith then spread. When Muhammad dies, you have the Caliph emerge, the idea of the successor of Muhammad. The Caliph is in essence going to be a religious leader, but the Caliph is also a secular leader. The Islamic faith in many ways is intertwined with the political world in much the same way as Christianity would become entwined with the kingdoms where it was embraced. You're going to have the Muslim faith spread through the caliphates throughout the known world, all the way to the Atlantic, all the way to the borders of China, and then slowly collapse upon it itself. In the end, however, you're going to have the spread of a new religion, the spread of Islam throughout much of the Western world. You're going to have the spread of Arab language, Arab culture throughout this area as well. It's going to be a great expansion of ideas, a great expansion of faith. It's going to be a community and a religious faith that's going to remain to this day as one of the world's great religions. So during the course of the semester, we've dealt with, and you've seen discussions of the rise of the Jewish faith, the rise of Christianity, and now the last of the 3 great religions, at least in the Western civilization context, is the Islamic faith. And now in future lectures, you're going to hear about the collapse of a lot of these Islamic provinces. You're going to talk about the resurgence of Christianity in a lot of areas, but that's another story for another time.
Okay, as we move along in our lecture series for Western Civilization 101, we will start to focus on, in our next lecture, the Middle Ages, which obviously encompasses quite a lot of information. When we come back for our next lecture, the focus will be on the Western European area, the medieval Western world, as it's sometimes called. You probably remember the Franks. They're a Germanic tribe that set up shop, I guess you could say, in what is now France, or used to be Gaul. And we'll learn more about their history, and a very, very pivotal figure in the Middle Ages, a man by the name, and you may have even heard of him, Charlemagne, and his Carolingian Empire that he creates out of what was once the Western Roman Empire. Until next time.